So tonight, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm honored to welcome Sebastian Junger to the Brattle Theater. He's here to discuss his latest book, entitled War. From June of 2007 to June of 2008, Sebastian Junger traveled several times to the Korangal Valley in eastern Afghanistan. There he followed a single platoon through a 15-month tour of duty of a most deadly location. From those experiences, Mr. Junger has produced an astonishing new book that chronicles the stark reality of modern combat. Catherine Schultz, in a recent Boston Globe review, calls war extraordinary and writes that, quote, "This new book is about war the way that The Perfect Storm was about weather." In both cases, Junger's real interest lies elsewhere. Many journalists embed with the military. Junger wants to get inside something more private and inscrutable, the nature of courage. War is messy and improvisational and refuses to conform to a narrative arc, and much the same could be said, approvingly, about Junger's book. Sebastian Junger's time in Afghanistan also resulted in Restrepo, a documentary film produced by Junger and Tim Hetherington, which recently won the Grand Jury Prize for a domestic documentary at the Sundance Film Festival. Sebastian Junger is an author, journalist, documentary filmmaker, and restaurateur. As a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and contributor to ABC News, he has covered international news stories around the globe, including Liberia, Sierra Leone, Kosovo, and elsewhere. He has won numerous awards for his journalism, which has been published in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, Outside, National Geographic Adventure, and elsewhere. He is also the author of several books, among them A Death in Belmont and Fire. His first and widely acclaimed book, The Perfect Storm, was made into a feature film and camped out on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 years. Mr. Junger is a native New Englander and a graduate of Wesleyan University. We are so thrilled to have him back in Massachusetts with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Please join me in welcoming Sebastian Junger.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very proud of that. It's my first movie, and I really saw it. I didn't see myself as a filmmaker. I saw myself out there as a journalist who had a video camera, and it really was just another facet of a journalistic project that I was engaged in. I wanted to know what it was like to be a soldier in combat. I had the idea that experience doesn't change much from war to war, from century to century, and I wanted to understand it. War is a very political thing. It must be, because it's such a terrible thing. It has to get argued about and talked about, and people need to disagree about it, because if we don't do that, we'll go to war too easily. The soldiers are probably the only people in this country not thinking about the war in political terms. People really struggle to understand that. The best analogy I can give is that policemen, I think very few talk about crime in terms of the socioeconomic conditions that produce it. I think they're busy fighting crime and trying not to get killed doing it. That's very much where soldiers are at emotionally about war. My experience in war started in 1993. I went to Bosnia. I'd been working as a waiter right upstairs at Casablanca, actually, and not very successfully. You can go over there afterwards and ask the owner. He remembers me, and he'll tell you I was not a good waiter. I went to Bosnia basically with a sleeping bag and a bunch of pens and notebooks and tried to figure out how to work as a freelance journalist, and I did figure it out. And it gave me a very complicated relationship with war, because when I went over there, it was the most intense and in many ways the most gratifying experience that I'd had in my life. And it was such a terrible thing. And all the other journalists I knew felt the same way about it, and it was very confusing. We finally watched NATO forces in 1995, after 3 years of prevaricating, after 250,000 civilian deaths, people who did not deserve to die, women, children, old men. NATO finally stepped in and bombed Serb positions around Sarajevo and started the end of the war. It ended very quickly after that. The killing stopped. You know, I grew up in the 80s. Central America, South America were the big liberal causes. I'm as liberal as you get, and the idea of civilian suffering was one of at the very top of my list of personal concerns. And what I saw in Bosnia was the use of force, the use of fighter planes to bring a halt to civilian suffering. And it gave me a very, very, I mean, no one wants to feel good about the use of fighter bombers, but watching what was happening in Bosnia felt even worse. And it gave me a very complicated relationship with the idea of using force. I think ultimately it's something that's necessary to protect people who can't defend themselves. We can have that conversation later if you want, but just so that you know where I'm coming from, this book is not about that. It's not political. I really wanted to write a book that gave readers access to what it feels like to be a soldier. I was in the Korengal Valley, 6 miles long, in very steep mountains. It looks like Colorado there. Big, huge cedar trees on the upper ridges, rushing rivers at the bottom of the valley. Absolutely beautiful. While I was there, it was in the Hindu Kush Mountains, right by the border with Pakistan, and while I was there, it was the scene of almost 1/5 of all the combat in all of Afghanistan. Battle company of the 173rd Airborne was stationed there at a small base, and so the 150 men of battle company went through almost 500 firefights in their deployment. They absorbed 1/5 of all the combat for 70,000 NATO soldiers in that country while I was there. It was very, very intense. I did 5 one-month trips, so did Tim, sometimes together, sometimes not. Trip by trip, we got to know the guys better and better until we really were kind of part of the platoon. I'm happy to say it. I lost all objectivity about the war as a whole. My safety depended on them. My sense of even minimal, like, emotional comfort out there depended on my connection to those guys. I had no objectivity. What was interesting to me was how my connection to those guys worked. It kind of mirrored what was happening between the men of the platoon itself. And ultimately, that was became the point of my book. The bonds that are formed in war between men, it was all men in the Korengal Valley, and how those bonds affect the individuals. Everyone out there was almost killed. Every single guy, including me. Every single guy out there could tell you about the bullet that almost hit him. There were guys walking around with holes in their uniforms from bullets that had cut through the fabric but not touched them. I was leaning against a HESCO one morning. A HESCO is a sort of a wire basket that they sort of lined with some kind of fabric, and you can fill, it's like a huge sandbag, 8 by 8 by 8, and they filled it with sand and rocks to form a fortification. I was leaning against a HESCO one morning, and you have to understand something about bullets, that they travel much faster than sound. So if someone shoots at you from far away, you don't know they're shooting at you because you hear gunfire. That happens later. It's almost a kind of footnote to the situation. The way you know they're shooting at you, if they don't hit you, is the bullets produce a kind of strange snapping sound in the air as they go by. It's pretty subtle, actually. So, you know, we would get hit sometimes, and the first thing guys would do is kind of look at each other. It was like, was that, are we getting, and then as soon as, you know, you're halfway through the sentence and you realize, yes, we are getting shot at, and everyone dives for cover. So I was leaning against a HESCO talking to someone, and some dirt flew into my face. And I had just time to think, what the hell was that? And we heard the gunfire that from those rounds. It was, you know, the first round of the first burst of a firefight that lasted an hour. And, you know, it must have hit a few inches from my head. I mean, it was hit close enough to spray my face with dirt. That's almost getting killed. And it gave me a lot to think about. And something like that happened every time I went out there. And it happened to the guys who were stuck out there for 15 months. It happened to them regularly. In some ways, it's a miracle that 80% of them weren't killed. I spent most of my time at an outpost called Restrepo. That's the name of our movie. It was named after the platoon medic, Juan Restrepo. He was from Colombia, the country of Colombia. He was shot in the throat during a patrol into the village of Aliabad, about halfway down the valley. The southern half of the valley was essentially controlled by the Taliban, the northern half by the U.S. He was shot in the throat, and he bled out. You know, he was the medic, so there was no medic to help him. I don't know if he may have been beyond help anyway, but he bled out trying to tell the men around him how to save his life. They couldn't do it. He was absolutely beloved within the platoon. He was a great medic. He was very brave, and he was a really nice guy. And it destroyed those guys. Combat is traumatic in many ways. And I realize now that I know these guys so well, after they came back, that the most traumatic thing about combat for them was the loss of their friends. The trauma of almost getting killed is nothing compared to watching your friend get killed. Nothing. And when that guy in the beginning of the movie, when he said, you know, I've been on every kind of sleeping pill and they don't help, that's how bad the nightmares are. Those are not nightmares about what almost happened to him. Those are nightmares about what happened to his friends. Guys he thought he might have been able to save, and he couldn't. The situation, the most painful situation to him was an American position was overrun on this hilltop during a multi-day operation, and he went sprinting up there to try to help the guys who were getting overrun. And by the time he got there, two guys were down and one guy was dead. His name was Larry Rugel. He was shot in the forehead. And he was tormented by the idea that if he'd run faster, he might have saved his friend Larry Rugel. I don't think he could have, but he couldn't let go of the idea that it was somehow his fault. And every night in his dreams, he was running up that hillside trying to get there in time. That was his nightmare, and he had it every night for probably a year. Restrepo was on the high ground south of the main base. Basically, in war, you try to get on the high ground and shoot down at your enemy. That works best. And there was a lot of high ground around the main base, and so at one point, the Taliban were attacking very effectively into the main base from this ridge to the south. So one night, they sent 2 platoons up there with pickaxes and shovels and, of course, their weapons, and they started digging. They had sandbags. There was no sand up there. It's all rock, so they chipped the rock out of the ridge with pickaxes and filled sandbags with rubble and stacked them up, and they worked all night long, and as soon as it got light, they got hit. They threw down their tools and grabbed their guns and shot back, and they did that until the shooting stopped, and they started working again, and they did that nonstop for 24 hours. They were in something like 13 firefights that day. It was a 2-hour walk from the main base up there at Restrepo. There was no running water, so the guys would do a 3 to 4 week rotation at Restrepo before coming back to the main base, so they couldn't bathe for a month, and because they couldn't bathe, they basically just lived in their clothes, which basically would get shredded by the vegetation, by the rocks up there, and basically just fall off them. There was no phone, there was no internet, there was no way to talk to their loved ones, their girlfriends or their wives, their families. There was no cooked food. It was incredibly hot in the summer and swarming with flies. Fleas, they all wore flea collars. It was insanely cold in the winter. They built little plywood hooches. They were so cramped that on the I did everything they did except obviously carry a weapon, but I lived identically to them, with them, and from my little bunk, I could reach out and with my arm touch 3 other men without too much difficulty. Tarantulas, scorpions, snakes, it was awful. All the things that young men like were not up there. I think I probably don't have to list those. And much of what people don't like was up there. And they were up there for a year. The way they dealt with it, one of the ways they dealt with it was with humor and just conversation. And they would literally sit around and do something that I don't think men of their age have done in several generations. They would just sit around and talk. And they'd look up and watch the clouds go by, and they would joke with each other, and they became very, very funny. They were incredibly funny. It was all men. There were no women in the Korengal Valley. I mean, no among the U.S. forces. It was all men. They were very isolated. They're 20 years old, and their humor was on the coarse side. But I'm going to, at the risk of offending, I'm going to read a little section about their humor. The guys are experts of a sort at being funny, and they seem to go out of their way to be. Maybe it's the only way to stay sane up there. Not because of the combat. You're never saner than when your survival is in question, but because of the unbelievable screaming boredom. Okay, who's going to die today was a standard one-liner before patrols. Their sense of humor was very vulgar, but incredibly morbid. And there was one guy named Anderson, and unfortunately, tragically, 2 other Andersons had been killed in the Korengal in previous deployments. So the Anderson in 2nd Platoon, the guys were just like, Anderson, man, forget it. You're not making it out of here. Like, you might as well give me your laptop now because it's not happening. Hey, Anderson, what do you want on your tombstone? I heard someone ask before we all headed down to Korengal. Korengal was the Korengal Valley. Korengal was an enemy village in the southern half, and virtually every time we went down there, we got hit. Now that's messed up, Anderson muttered as he put on his helmet. Before patrols, guys promised their laptops to each other or their new boots or their iPods. One pair of friends had a serious agreement that if one of them should die, the other would erase all the porn on his laptop before the Army could ship it back to his mom. Mothers were an irresistible source of humor. If I start banging your mom when we get home, will that mean I'm your dad? Or some version of that was pretty much boilerplate humor at Restrepo. Once I watched O'Byrne, O'Byrne was sort of the main character in my book. He was the only guy that got out of 2nd Platoon. They got out of the Army. Everyone else stayed in the Army. About a third of the platoon was like 35 men. About a third of them, about 10 guys, are back in Kunar province fighting very close to where they had been in 07, 08. Brendan got out. I had a very good relationship with him over there, and it deepened stateside. And the book, it doesn't focus on him, but he's kind of the through line for it. He's the guy you follow. Once I watched O'Byrne grab someone's ass and give it a good deep squeeze. When the man demanded an explanation, O'Byrne said, "I'm just trying to get an idea what your mom's ass is going to feel like when we get home." Only wives and girlfriends are off limits because the men are already so riddled with anxiety over what's going on back home that almost nothing you could say would be funny. Anything else, mothers, sisters, retarded nephews, is fair game. After it was all over, I invited, Brendan O'Byrne was back in the States, and I invited him to a dinner party to meet some of my friends. And a woman asked him, so, as bad as it was out there, was there anything at all that you missed about being out at Restrepo? And without a hint of irony, Brendan said, yeah, I missed almost all of it. And I thought, what an amazing thing. What a thing that needs to be answered. How is it you can take a young man, put him on a hilltop, and almost kill him for a year, kill his best friends, deprive him of everything that's enjoyable in life, inflict incredible hardships on him, and then he comes home to the delights of civilization, and after a few boozy weeks, they were based in Vicenza, Italy, so they came back to Vicenza, and it's pretty much everything a young man wants right outside the gates of the base. And after a few weeks of that, most of those guys wanted to go back to Restrepo. Why is that? What is it that was happening out there that became so necessary to them, so necessary to their sense of themselves, their identity, their sense of purpose? What is it that's not happening back home or at that base in Italy? They called Italy coward's land because men who had never been in combat could order around men who have been. That's even more true of civilian society back home. All the rules that kept them alive and kept them psychologically intact, all the rules of behavior, the understanding that they had between each other. As Brendan said once, there are men in the platoon who straight up hate each other, but we would all die for each other. All of those rules that kept them alive and sane out there, not only do they not apply here, they're actively dysfunctional. They will actively get you in trouble. And what I wanted to do in my book is explain that thing that those young men were after. What was it out there that they were responding to? I think often society sort of dismisses it as, well, they got addicted to combat, they're adrenaline junkies. I think the movie The Hurt Locker, a movie which I thought in many ways was a wonderful movie, in this particular case, it really erred in ascribing the desire to return from civilian life, family life, back into a situation where you'll probably get killed, sort of ascribing that to adrenaline. That really is not what it is. I think it's a part of what it is, but on a much more profound level, I think what the real drug we're talking about is the drug of brotherhood, the drug of human connection, the drug of being absolutely necessary to 30 other men who are absolutely necessary to you. If you think about it, a 19-year-old who does not have a very solid, articulated place in society. At 19, I certainly didn't. I think most 19-year-olds don't. And then suddenly you put him in a place where he's absolutely necessary to his brothers, where his job is absolutely clear. You're the 240 gunner on weapons squad, and this is your job. It's not easy, but it's simple, and it's clear, and it's unambiguous, and you can completely reinvent. Combat is completely self-determining. It doesn't matter how you were born, where you were born, what your name is, what your race is. Doesn't matter anything as long as you are that you function well as a soldier and you protect your brothers out there. That's it. And as long as you do that, you're at the top of the totem pole, at least among those men. Now imagine the emotional security of that situation, what a relief it would be for a 19-year-old to find himself in a situation like that. Like, oh, finally, I don't have to figure out who I am and how people feel about me. You take that, you give them that for a year, and they come back to this society, and all of a sudden their entire identity is up for grabs again. I think that is what is difficult for these guys. The Army, well, back up. Fear is unavoidable in combat. It's unavoidable for soldiers, it's unavoidable for the press. I've been covering wars for a long time, and the one thing you really have to figure out is how to establish a relationship with your own fear. Because the fear is not going to disappear, and it shouldn't. When it does, you get killed. But you do need a relationship with it where you're in control. So I became quite interested in how I experienced fear. I was in a Humvee that was blown up. The footage at the very beginning, I don't know if you caught it, right at the beginning of the trailer, we're driving along in a Humvee, and suddenly sort of everything goes orange for a moment. That was me getting blown up. By some miracle, I happened to have the camera running, so we got it on film. We were stuck in that Humvee. It was on fire. We were taking fire. We were choking on toxic smoke, and we couldn't get out because we were worried about how much gunfire there was. And we were stuck in there, and the captain finally gave the order to bail out, and we did. We all got out okay. But while we were stuck in there for a couple of minutes, I had so little fear that I was actually worried I'd been hit. I thought I'd gone into shock. I remember saying to myself, you have to get scared because this is a bad situation. Start taking it seriously. All the fear happened later that night. In combat, fear, at least, with virtually no exception, fear was not an issue in combat. It was a big issue beforehand. The scaredest I was out there was before a big operation that seemed scary, the night before. Dread is way worse than what people imagine to be the fear of combat. At least for me and the guys I was with, you sort of go into a kind of automatic, you become sort of high functioning and automatic in combat. Dread beforehand was like, it felt like poison in my bloodstream. And then afterwards, the fear could play with your mind in all kinds of weird ways, nightmares, that kind of thing. We all got kind of jumpy. And you can obsess about, the IED went off under the engine block instead of under me, under us, 10-foot difference. You can obsess. You can obsess about 3 inches, you can obsess about 10 feet. As I say in the book, it just seemed appalling that so much could be determined by so little. So the military studied fear, and they've studied courage. Obviously, without courage, soldiers couldn't function, and armies would lose. And sometimes they would lose wars which they really need to win, like World War II. And I would argue this one, but that's another conversation. But it's difficult to study courage because soldiers really don't acknowledge it. It's really interesting. You try to ask soldiers about, I mean, I saw, we were in a firefight once, and a guy got injured, and two guys ran out into heavy machine gun fire to drag him to safety. He was fully in the open. There were bullets hitting all around him. They didn't even hesitate. They ran into the open, grabbed him, pulled him to safety, and I tried to ask them about it later. This guy named Sergeant E.R. And he said, that's not bravery. I mean, I did it because he would have done it for me, and the fact that he would have done it for me is the only thing that makes any of this psychologically possible in the first place. For a soldier, running through gunfire to save your friend, your brother, your platoon mate, doesn't require extraordinary courage. It's simply your job description as a soldier, not to mention as a friend. So when you try to tell a soldier that he was brave, it's like telling a mother who ran into traffic to grab her kid from getting hit by a car. Try to tell that mother that she was brave. I mean, no, she was being a mother who was worried about her son. The same thing with soldiers. Like, come on, man, that was my buddy out there. What, was I supposed to sit here behind a tree and watch him get shot? So it's quite hard to study. But I dug up a lot of old research into how courage works, and it's kind of the question I wanted to answer in my book. Like, how does it work? Neurologically, psychologically, sociologically, how do you get people, in this case men, to risk or sacrifice their life for someone else? It's kind of an extraordinary decision to make. I mean, people make it reflexively with their children, maybe with their spouses, but for another guy, another 19-year-old guy, it doesn't, at first glance, it doesn't seem to make sense. Darwin would certainly say it doesn't make sense because the brave guy who threw himself on the hand grenade, his brave genes are not going to get passed on, and the less brave genes of everyone else in the bunker are going to get passed on. So how does that work exactly? That's one of the things my book goes into. But here is just a sort of anecdote that I found in one of these studies. In World War II, guys would get wounded and they'd be brought back to a rear base hospital, and as soon as they could, they would go AWOL. They would literally sneak out the windows of the hospital and go AWOL to get back to the front line and rejoin their unit faster than the Army would let them. That's the brotherhood that I'm talking about. These guys were emotionally more comfortable under fire with their friends than they were in safety in the rear. I'm going to finish with another brief passage, and I'll take some questions. One night, a few weeks later, I'm sitting on the ammo hooch listening to the monkeys in the peaks. A temperature inversion has filled the valley with mist, and the mist is silver in the moonlight and almost liquid. Airborne was the platoon dog. They got him as a puppy from the Afghans. The 173rd, the unit that I was with, they're airborne infantry. And as airborne infantry, they look down on all other infantry. They're qualified to jump out of airplanes with parachutes. The rest of no other infantry is, and airborne calls them legs. That's not a complimentary term. And so they were leaving the Korengal, and the next unit that was going to replace them was the 1st ID, the 1st Infantry Division, a leg unit. And so the guys named their dog Airborne because Airborne was going to stay at the outpost. So the 1st ID was going to come in, and they were going to have to, every time they called their dog, they were going to be reminded of their endless inferiority compared to airborne troops. Airborne is asleep, but keeps popping his head up to growl at some threat impossibly far below us in the valley. There's been a big fight over by the Pakistan border, and F-15s and 16s have been powering overhead all evening, looking for people to kill. O'Byrne wanders out, and we start talking. His head is shaved, but dirt sticks to the stubble so you can see where his hair ought to be. He says he signed a contract with the Army that's almost up, and he has to figure out whether to re-enlist. Combat is such an adrenaline rush, he says. I'm worried I'll be looking for that when I get home, and if I can't find it, I'll just start drinking and getting in trouble. People back home think we drink because of the bad stuff, but that's not true. We drink because we miss the good stuff. It's a stressful way to live, but once it's blown out your levels, almost everything else looks boring. O'Byrne knows himself. When he gets bored, he starts drinking and getting into fights, and then it's only a matter of time until he's back in the system. If that's the case, he might as well stay in the system, a better one, and actually move upward. I suggest a few civilian jobs that offer a little adrenaline, wilderness trip guide, firefighter, but we both know it's just not the same. We are at one of the most exposed outposts in the entire U.S. military, and he's crawling out of his skin because there hasn't been a good firefight in a week. How do you bring a guy like that back into the world? Civilians balk at recognizing that one of the most traumatic things about combat is having to give it up. War is so obviously evil and wrong that the idea there could be anything good to it almost feels like a profanity. And yet throughout history, men like Mack and Rice and O'Byrne have come home to find themselves desperately missing what should have been the worst experience of their lives. To a combat vet, the civilian world can seem frivolous and dull with very little at stake and all the wrong people in power. These men come home and quickly find themselves getting berated by a rear-base major who's never seen combat or arguing with their girlfriend about some domestic issue they don't even understand. When men say they miss combat, it's not that they actually miss getting shot at. You'd have to be deranged. It's that they miss being in a world where everything is important and nothing is taken for granted. They miss being in a world where human relations are entirely governed by whether you can trust the other person with your life. It's such a pure, clean standard that men can completely remake themselves in war. You could be anything back home, shy, ugly, rich, poor, unpopular, and it won't matter because it's of no consequence in a firefight and therefore of no consequence, period. The only thing that matters is your level of dedication to the rest of the group, and that is almost impossible to fake. That is why the men say such impossibly vulgar things about each other's sisters and mothers. It's one more way to prove that nothing can break the bond between them. It's one more way to prove they're not alone out there. War is a big and sprawling word that brings a lot of human suffering into the conversation, but combat is a different matter. Combat is the smaller game that young men fall in love with, and any solution to the human problem of war will have to take into account the psyches of these young men. For some reason, there is a profound and mysterious gratification to the reciprocal agreement to protect another person with your life, and combat is virtually the only situation in which that happens regularly. These hillsides of loose shale and holly trees are where the men feel not most alive, that you can get skydiving, but the most utilized, the most necessary, the most clear and certain and purposeful. If young men could get that feeling at home, no one would ever want to go to war again, but they can't. So here sits Sergeant Brendan O'Byrne, 1 month before the end of deployment, seriously contemplating signing back up. I prayed only once in Afghanistan, O'Byrne wrote me after it was all over. It was when Restrepo got shot, and I prayed to God to let him live. But God, Allah, Jehovah, Zeus, or whatever a person may call God, wasn't in that valley. Combat is the devil's game. God wanted no part. That's why our prayers weren't answered. The only one listening was Satan. So before I start the Q&A, the soldiers, in their minds, they are fighting for us. That's how they describe their job to themselves. They know that the war is very divisive back home. There are people for it, people against it. That's not a distinction that's important to them. They're fighting for American citizens. And one of the problems, I think, in the paradigm right now is that the people who are doing the fighting and the people that they understand themselves to be fighting for really don't have any way to communicate. So there's a lot of misunderstandings. The only medium they have to communicate through is the press. And the press is freighted with all kinds of political baggage, both left-wing and right-wing. And it doesn't work very well as a way of holding a conversation. So what I wanted to do is start that conversation in a way that bypasses the military, bypasses the press, bypasses the government, and for that matter, bypasses me. On my website, it's very simple, sebastianjunger.com. Very simple. There's a tab on the left that you can click on, and as you read my book, and say on page 123, Sergeant McDonough does something that is you have a question about, you have a comment on, you're curious about, or you're just curious how he's doing now. McDonough's still in the Army. McDonough's in this country. Jones is back over there. You want to ask Jones how he's, what he did today, how's it going? You can email him. You just click on his photo and send him an email. And I promise you, these guys are eager to hear from you, that you are why they are there in their minds. They have a lot to say. And I'm sure you guys have a lot to say to them. The one thing that I would say is to you is that they are not, their experience in war is a very, very personal and emotional one. It's not particularly a political one. So what I would say is to keep your conversation with them on kind of human terms, emotional terms. If you raise a very intense political point, you may get an intense political answer or not, I don't know, but I think their jobs for the moment are hard enough as it is, and they may not need that stress. So with that as a caveat, I hope you read my book, and please communicate with these guys because they really, truly are waiting to hear from you. So thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I mean, I should say that he was a lieutenant, the guy yeah, I mean, his, the captain or the battalion commander above him, if they thought it was important to have a journalist with that guy, there'd be a journalist with him. So he isn't the last word on it. I mean, the press, there are good journalists and bad journalists. There's abrasive journalists and non-abrasive journalists. Same with soldiers, and we all get along sometimes or not. And I'm pretty good at fitting into a group of men. I don't know. I've made a whole career out of. I mean, when I was in Gloucester writing about the fishing industry, that was a tough crowd to crack. And there's ways to do it. There's ways to be polite and direct and honest, and people pick up on that. And I was just out there so damn much. I mean, every time they turned around, I was coming back out. And so after a while, I got blown up. Tim broke his leg in combat and walked all night on a broken leg. So as not to slow those guys down, to slow them down would have been to really put them in danger. So I just imagine what that night was like for him, coming down off the Abascar Mountain on a broken leg. Soldiers understand that kind of thing. And so after a couple of trips, they realized, when journalists go out to see them, they're only there once, they never go back. We just kept going back. And so we really became part of the platoon, I think partly just out of familiarity. In general, about the embed program, it's very controversial. What people don't realize is that all of journalism is an embed program. I mean, you go to Liberia to cover the Liberian Civil War, as I was in '03, like it or not, you're embedded with child soldiers fighting for Charles Taylor, and you better be embedded with them because if you're not, they could easily kill you. Any piece of experiential journalism that you commit is some form of embedding, and I think it is way better. Whatever the downsides are, fraternization, sort of falling in love with your topic, et cetera, I mean, all that can happen anywhere. There's nothing special about the U.S. Army that predisposes people towards that. But whatever the downsides, the upsides is that the U.S. military is being monitored by civilians and ultimately can be held accountable for what they do wrong, or for that matter, and it's equally important, praised for what they do right. And no one would know about any of it if there wasn't press out there. So, when we were out there, we had footage of everything. American soldiers getting killed, American soldiers crying about the ones who got killed, civilian casualties from airstrikes that went wrong. No one ever put a hand on our shoulder and said, put the camera down. It was pretty extraordinary. And seriously, I can't think of another military in the world who gives that much access to the press. So, I'm just very, very grateful that in this country we have that kind of access. I think it's really, really important. I think that's suicidal and impossible if he's shooting at you. I mean, it's a beautiful principle, but, you know, I was almost killed out there. Like, I didn't love those guys, you know. And they didn't love us. Like, war doesn't work that way. It really doesn't, unfortunately. I mean, if that worked, there wouldn't be war, but it doesn't work. The only thing that kept those guys alive out there was that they shot back harder and faster than they were getting shot at. That's it. If they had stood up on the bunker waving their arms, going, stop, 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 they just would have been killed. So it's a beautiful idea. I don't think it's realistic, unfortunately. Her father was in Vietnam and came back and never fully adjusted to it. What can be done? You know, some problems don't have solutions. I mean, I think things can be handled better or worse, and I think the military is learning how to handle returning veterans better. They're getting quite a lot of psychiatric care. They get a lot of counseling even when they're out there. There was a brigade shrink that kept coming through the Korengal trying to talk to guys. You know, in combat, you don't really want to talk about your feelings because talking about them opens you up and makes you vulnerable, and then you're less safe, ultimately. You don't want to be in touch with your feelings in combat. And, but I think the military is learning. I mean, psychiatry in general has come an awfully long way since the 60s. So, but ultimately, trauma is traumatizing. I mean, you have a terrible car accident, and you know your wife gets killed in the passenger seat next to you. I'm sorry, you're not going to get over it. That's, you know, like, you maybe shouldn't get over it. And I think the part that can be dealt with successfully is the part that I was talking about earlier. If our society can make available a sense of brotherhood to guys who experienced it out there, I think they'll feel a lot safer. I have no idea how to begin doing that. It's just an idea. But I feel that that would go a long way towards reducing the sense of dislocation and confusion when these guys come home, the platoon splits up, and suddenly everyone's, you know, back in their hometown, you know, a few years older, thinking, "Whoa, what just happened? Like, where am I?" It's a very confusing thing to them. Yeah, I mean, that was almost more of a literary choice. Combat, if I had called my book Combat, people would have looked at it and thought that it was one of those sort of like how to, you know, like military, you know, like, I mean, that was not what I wanted to communicate. I wanted a book, I wanted a title, I wanted a book that was as universal and profound as possible. And even the word combat felt too specific. War is a blunt, short, ugly word. And that's kind of what I was looking for. So it was really more of a literary decision than a kind of semantic one. Under that kind of pressure and stress, don't some of the guys break down? Yes, they do. Absolutely. And one or two broke down and never put themselves back together, and they were transferred to a unit that was not under that much stress and where they wouldn't get themselves or someone else killed. For the most part, they reassembled themselves pretty effectively. Absolutely. They do. They debate it. They argue about it. And at the end of the day, almost always they follow orders. I'm sure once in a while they refuse to because they just can't bring themselves to. For the most part, I think the orders are quite smart. I mean, the officers that I met, the guys coming up with the orders, with the plans, literally without exception, were incredibly smart guys. The battalion commander had graduated from the Fletcher School and up at Tufts. The company commander, Captain Kearney, incredibly capable, smart guy. The lieutenants, I mean, you know, what I realized later is that the military is smart enough to know that you have to put the very best soldiers in the worst places because anything less will just get chewed up. So this was not admittedly a representative sampling. I mean, this was the best of the best, but they were incredibly good. So most of the orders, I think, were fine, but once in a while, the guys would really shake their heads about why the hell are we doing it this way? And that presents a confusing situation for a soldier. And also, they don't see the big picture. Like, sometimes a platoon is told to do something because that for the platoon itself might look just crazy, but it's part of a bigger machine that's operating across the entire battalion, and they just have to get to the top of that hill by noon, no matter how dangerous it is, even though it might be safer to wait till dark. but the rest of the battalion can't wait, and they go up there. And so that's, on the grounds, some stuff looks incredibly stupid, but the guys know that they don't have the big perspective and they're professional pawns. I mean, that's what soldiers are, and they know it, and they're okay with it for the most part. So that's a great point. I mean, for me, I mean, often people ask me, like, what the effect was on me. And, pretty predictable. I mean, I came back a little jumpy, I had the usual nightmares and et cetera. I'd wake up. I live in New York, and the garbage trucks go through at 4 a.m, and they hit potholes. And when the big metal container at the back of the truck jumps in the air and comes down on the chassis, it sounds exactly like a mortar. And boy, would I get out of bed fast at 4 a.m. That went on for a while. Those effects were kind of transitory. The one effect that actually wasn't transitory, but it was really quite positive. Like the experience out there, not the trauma, the effect of being around these guys who were in such a tight group, I think, made me quite emotional. Like, I had real feelings about, things I'd never had feelings about before. Like the typical, like you go to, I think a lot of young men go through this. You go to your wedding, you're in your 20s, you go to a wedding, and all the women are crying. And you're just like, what the hell are they crying about, right? They're crying because they're moved, right? Something of significance is happening in front of them, and it's moving them, right? I get that now. Like, I mean, I'm 48, better late than never, but it really, something about what happened out there really kind of opened me up to the whole spectrum of sort of human connection and experience, and that happened with the other guys too. I mean, they were really puzzled, like, I don't know what's happening, but, I mean, a couple of them said to me, like, man, we don't know what's happening. We're turning into girls, like, we're just crying all the time. And so I found out the term for this later. There's a term I didn't know called, everyone knows post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also something called post-traumatic growth. And there are positive things that happen that come out of an ordeal like a year in combat. So we mustn't, as civilians, just decide, oh, war is bad, so everything that comes out of it, every effect it has on human beings, by definition, has to be bad. That's really not the case. And I think it's very important in terms of incorporating these soldiers when they come home back into society. It's very important to understand the sort of the subtleties of all this, because it gets very subtle, but it's all very important. So we just hit the 7 o'clock mark. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking tonight. Thank you.